Guy of Lusignan ruled Jerusalem for only a few years, but his name became tied to one of the most catastrophic collapses in Crusader history. He came to power in 1186 after marrying Queen Sibylla and taking the throne through her claim, not through the kind of strength that could hold a kingdom together in a crisis. Jerusalem was already under pressure from Saladin, whose armies were uniting Muslim power across the region, and Guy was the kind of ruler who looked impressive in ceremony but dangerous in war. He hesitated, misread his enemies, and allowed the kingdom to drift into disaster. In 1187, he led the Crusader army into the Battle of Hattin. It was a march into thirst, heat, exhaustion, and ruin. Saladin destroyed the Crusader host, captured Guy alive, and shattered the military backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The loss of Hattin opened the road to Jerusalem itself, and within months the city fell. Guy's reign became a symbol of collapse, a king who inherited a holy kingdom and left behind a broken one. After his release, Guy did not recover Jerusalem. Instead, he became a ruler without the kingdom he had once claimed. He later took Cyprus, where the Lusignan line survived for generations, but the name would always carry the memory of Hattin. Richard Ed of England, remembered as Richard the Lionheart, never truly ruled Jerusalem, but few kings came closer to becoming its savior. When he arrived in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade in 1191, Jerusalem had already fallen to Saladin 4 years earlier after the disaster at Hattin. The Crusader states were weakened, divided, and struggling to survive. Richard arrived with one of the most powerful armies in Christendom and quickly established himself as the most feared military commander in the region. He captured Acre, defeated Saladin at Arsuf, and restored Crusader control along much of the coast. For a moment, it appeared possible that Jerusalem itself might be recovered. Richard's reputation was built on battlefield brilliance. Contemporary chroniclers described him fighting in the front ranks, leading cavalry charges, and inspiring soldiers through sheer force of personality. Yet the city that defined the crusade remained beyond his grasp. Twice he advanced toward Jerusalem. Twice he turned back. He understood that capturing the city was easier than holding it, and that a victorious march could become a disaster if Saladin trapped his army far from the coast. The king who could defeat armies could not defeat geography, logistics, and time. In 1192, Richard negotiated a settlement with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. It was a practical compromise, but not the victory Europe had hoped for. He departed the Holy Land having won battles, restored Crusader territory, and secured the survival of the kingdom, yet without reclaiming the city that had brought him there. Richard died in 1199 after being struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in France. Infection spread through the wound, and within days the most famous Crusader king of the age was dead. The Lionheart saved the Kingdom of Jerusalem from immediate collapse, but the city itself remained beyond his reach. History remembered him as the greatest Crusader king who never wore Jerusalem's crown. Amalric I ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem from 1163 to 1174 and inherited a Crusader state that appeared strong on the surface, but was increasingly surrounded by larger and more organized enemies. Unlike many Crusader kings, Amalric understood that the future of Jerusalem would be decided not only in the Holy Land but also in Egypt. At the time, Egypt was wealthy, divided, and politically unstable. Amalric believed that whoever controlled Egypt would eventually control the balance of power across the eastern Mediterranean. He launched a series of invasions into Egypt throughout the 1160s, hoping to bring the country under Crusader influence before a stronger rival could do the same. At first, the campaigns seemed promising. Egyptian factions sought his support, cities opened their gates, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem briefly appeared on the edge of its greatest expansion. But Amalric's victories were never decisive. His repeated interventions drew the attention of Nur ad-Din, the powerful ruler of Syria, who sent one of his most capable commanders, Shirkuh, into Egypt. With Shirkuh came his young nephew, a man history would remember as Saladin. The consequences were enormous. Instead of securing Egypt for Jerusalem, Amalric's campaigns helped create the conditions that allowed Saladin to rise to power. By 1171, Saladin had become ruler of Egypt, uniting its resources with those of Syria. For the first time, the Crusader states faced an enemy capable of surrounding them from multiple directions. Amalric spent his final years trying to contain the threat he had unintentionally helped create. In 1174, while preparing another campaign, Amalric contracted a severe illness, most likely dysentery or typhoid fever. He died in Jerusalem at about 38 years old. His young son Baldwin inherited the throne, while Saladin continued building the power that would eventually destroy much of the Crusader kingdom. Fulk of Jerusalem became king in 1131 through his marriage to Melisende, inheriting a Crusader kingdom that was powerful but increasingly threatened by ambitious Muslim rulers on its borders. Before arriving in the Holy Land, Fulk had been Count of Anjou in France, a seasoned noble with decades of military experience. The nobles of Jerusalem expected a strong ruler capable of defending the kingdom. What they received was a king whose greatest battles would often be against his own court. Fulk quickly attempted to concentrate power around himself, sidelining local nobles and even challenging the influence of Queen Melisende, who possessed a stronger claim to the throne than he did. The resulting political conflict divided the kingdom. Several leading barons revolted, and for a time Jerusalem seemed more threatened by internal rivalry than foreign invasion. Fulk eventually realized that ruling Jerusalem required cooperation rather than domination. Melisende emerged as an equal partner in government, and together they stabilized the kingdom after years of tension. His greatest achievement came along the northern frontier. Fulk strengthened castles, reinforced defenses, and resisted the growing power of the Turkish ruler Zengi, whose campaigns threatened the Crusader states. Fortresses such as Kerak and other frontier strongholds became symbols of a kingdom preparing for a longer struggle. While later Crusader kings sought glory through conquest, Fulk focused on survival. He understood that Jerusalem's greatest victory might simply be enduring another generation. In 1143, while hunting near Acre, Fulk's horse stumbled and threw him violently to the ground. The saddle struck his head, causing severe injuries. He lingered for several days before dying at about 51 years old. His death shocked the kingdom because it came not in battle, siege, or crusade, but during a routine hunt. Melisende assumed a larger role in government, while their son Baldwin III inherited the throne. Melisende ruled Jerusalem from 1131 to 1161 and became one of the most powerful queens in Crusader history. She was the daughter of King Baldwin II and inherited a kingdom that stood at the center of the Christian world. Unlike many medieval queens who ruled through husbands or sons, Melisende exercised authority in her own right. When her husband, Fulk of Anjou, became king, he attempted to concentrate power around himself and reduce her influence. The effort nearly divided the kingdom. The struggle between Melisende and Fulk created one of the most serious political crises Jerusalem had faced since its founding. Noble factions formed around each ruler, and tensions rose to the point where civil conflict seemed possible. Yet Melisende possessed something many Crusader kings lacked: the support of the kingdom's leading nobles and clergy. Fulk eventually accepted a partnership rather than domination, and Melisende emerged as a central figure in government. Together they stabilized the kingdom and strengthened its defenses against growing threats beyond its borders. After Fulk's death in 1143, Melisende effectively became the dominant ruler of Jerusalem. She sponsored churches, monasteries, and major building projects while overseeing diplomacy, military affairs, and royal administration. Contemporary chroniclers described her as intelligent, politically skilled, and exceptionally capable. For nearly 2 decades, she helped guide the kingdom through one of the most dangerous periods of its existence. Yet her greatest challenge came from within her own family. As her son Baldwin III grew older, he demanded full control of the throne, leading to a struggle that mirrored the conflict she had once faced with Fulk. In 1152, Baldwin III forced a division of the kingdom and eventually secured sole rule. Melisende withdrew from direct political power, but remained one of the most respected figures in Jerusalem. She died in 1161, probably from natural causes, after helping govern the kingdom for nearly 30 years. Baldwin III became king of Jerusalem in 1143 after the death of his father Fulk, but real power initially remained in the hands of his mother Melisende. The kingdom he inherited was one of the strongest Crusader states ever created, yet it was surrounded by increasingly dangerous enemies. As Baldwin grew older, he became frustrated with ruling in his mother's shadow. What began as a partnership slowly turned into a struggle for control of the throne itself. By 1152, the dispute had escalated into a political crisis. The kingdom was divided between supporters of Baldwin and supporters of Melisende. Unlike many medieval succession conflicts, this one did not involve foreign invaders or rival dynasties. It was a battle between two capable rulers of the same family. Baldwin eventually emerged victorious, securing sole control of Jerusalem while allowing his mother to retain honor and influence. The kingdom avoided a civil war, but the struggle revealed how fragile even the strongest Crusader state could become. Once in full control, Baldwin proved himself one of Jerusalem's most effective kings. His greatest achievement came in 1153 with the capture of Ascalon, the last major Egyptian stronghold on the Palestinian coast. The victory removed a long-standing threat and completed a goal Crusader rulers had pursued for decades. For a brief moment, Jerusalem appeared stronger than ever. Yet, beyond its borders, a new danger was emerging. The Muslim world was gradually becoming more united under leaders determined to reverse the gains of the Crusades. In 1163, while still only in his early 30s, Baldwin fell seriously ill, most likely from disease common in the region. He died in 1163 at about 33 years old without leaving an heir. His brother Amalric succeeded him. Saladin rose from a relatively obscure Kurdish military family to become the most powerful ruler in the Middle East and the man who ended nearly a century of Crusader dominance in Jerusalem. When he arrived in Egypt in the 1160s as part of his uncle Shirkuh's army, few would have predicted that he would eventually unite Egypt, Syria, and much of the Islamic world under a single banner. Yet within a generation, Saladin had achieved what many Muslim rulers before him had failed to do. He transformed a divided region into a coalition capable of confronting the Crusader states. His greatest victory came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army, exhausted by heat and thirst, was surrounded and destroyed. Thousands were captured, including King Guy of Jerusalem. The defeat shattered the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and opened the road to the Holy City itself. Later that year, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin after nearly 90 years of Crusader rule. Unlike the massacre that followed the Crusader conquest of 1099, Saladin allowed most inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave, a decision that became central to his reputation in both Islamic and European history. Yet his empire depended heavily on his personal authority. While he spent years fighting Crusaders, he also had to manage rival Muslim rulers, ambitious relatives, and competing regional interests. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade prevented Saladin from completely destroying the Crusader presence on the coast. Even at the height of his power, victory remained incomplete. In 1193, only months after concluding peace with Richard, Saladin fell ill in Damascus, most likely from fever or disease. He died at about 55 years old. Chroniclers recorded that the ruler, who had controlled enormous wealth, left behind surprisingly little personal fortune. His empire was divided among his heirs almost immediately. Baldwin I was the first true king of Jerusalem and the man who transformed a fragile Crusader conquest into a functioning kingdom. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, the city was surrounded by enemies, isolated from Europe and uncertain of its future. Baldwin, the younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, inherited that uncertainty in 1100 and immediately began turning survival into expansion. He understood that Jerusalem could not remain a holy city alone. It had to become a state capable of defending itself. Unlike many Crusader leaders, Baldwin was ambitious, practical, and relentless. He campaigned almost every year of his reign, capturing key coastal cities including Acre, Beirut, and Sidon. These victories connected Jerusalem to Mediterranean trade and allowed reinforcements from Europe to reach the kingdom more easily. He also defeated repeated invasions from the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, proving that the Crusader state could survive against larger and wealthier opponents. By the end of his reign, the Kingdom of Jerusalem controlled far more territory than it had at his accession, yet Baldwin ruled through constant warfare because peace was never guaranteed. The kingdom depended heavily on his military leadership, and every victory required another campaign. He spent years marching across deserts, besieging cities, and defending borders that were always vulnerable. The Crusader state appeared strong, but much of that strength rested on the determination of one man. In 1118, while returning from an expedition toward Egypt, Baldwin fell seriously ill, probably from disease or exhaustion after years of campaigning. He died near the Nile at about 58 years old. His body was carried back to Jerusalem and buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Baldwin had inherited a city surrounded by enemies and left behind a kingdom stretching across much of the Levantine coast. Godfrey of Bouillon was the leader who helped capture Jerusalem during the First Crusade and became the first ruler of the newly conquered city. Before arriving in the Holy Land, he was a powerful noble from Lower Lorraine, but it was the Crusade that transformed him into a legend. In 1099, after a brutal siege, Crusader forces stormed Jerusalem and seized the city from Fatimid control. The victory shocked both Europe and the Islamic world. After decades of preaching, marching, starvation, and battle, the Crusaders had achieved the goal that brought them across continents. Unlike many victorious commanders, Godfrey refused to call himself king. He reportedly believed that he should not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he adopted the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The decision enhanced his reputation for humility, but it did not reduce the challenges facing the new Crusader state. Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies, isolated from Europe, and desperately short of men and resources. The conquest had been won. Survival was another matter entirely. Within weeks of taking the city, Godfrey led his forces against a large Fatimid army advancing from Egypt. At the Battle of Ascalon in August 1099, the Crusaders won a decisive victory that secured Jerusalem from immediate reconquest. It was one of the most important battles in Crusader history, ensuring that the newly established Christian state would survive beyond its first year. Godfrey ruled for less than a year after the conquest. In July 1100, he fell seriously ill, most likely from disease, though later legends suggested poisoning. He died in Jerusalem at about 40 years old. His brother Baldwin succeeded him and transformed the fragile conquest into a kingdom. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem became king in 1174 at the age of 13 after the death of his father, Amalric. Even before his coronation, his future had already been marked by tragedy. As a child, he was diagnosed with leprosy after his tutor noticed he could not feel pain in one of his arms. In the medieval world, leprosy was often treated as a death sentence, yet Baldwin inherited a kingdom facing an even greater threat. To the north and south, Saladin was steadily uniting the Muslim world into a single power capable of surrounding Jerusalem. Most rulers spent their youth preparing to govern. Baldwin spent his preparing to fight while his body slowly failed him. Despite his illness, he proved to be one of the most capable military leaders Jerusalem ever produced. In 1177, when Saladin invaded with a much larger army, Baldwin led his forces to the Battle of Montgisard. Against overwhelming odds, the Crusaders shattered Saladin's army and forced one of history's greatest commanders into retreat. The victory became legendary. For a moment, the young king with leprosy has achieved what healthier and stronger rulers could not, yet Baldwin's greatest enemy remained his own disease. As the years passed, he gradually lost the ability to walk, ride, and even use his hands effectively. Government increasingly depended on regents, nobles, and rival factions competing for influence around the throne. At the same time, Saladin continued growing stronger while Jerusalem became increasingly divided by internal politics. Baldwin spent much of his reign holding together a kingdom that seemed determined to tear itself apart. In 1185, after years of physical decline, Baldwin died in Jerusalem at about 24 years old. He left no heir and no clear solution to the succession crisis already forming around the crown. Within 2 years, the kingdom suffered the disaster of Hattin, and in 1187 Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin.